Nietzsche's most dangerous discovery wasn't about God's death or the will to power. It was about what happens to those who awaken, those who see through society's illusions, and why this awareness often destroys them. In his personal journals and private correspondence, Nietzsche documented a psychological pattern so threatening to the social order that he coded it in metaphors and paradoxes. He observed individuals capable of seeing through cultural hypnosis, moral theater, and collective delusions that everyone else accepted as reality. These rare souls pierced the veil of what he called the herd mentality and glimpsed the machinery beneath social conventions. But Nietzsche discovered something terrifying about these awakened individuals. They consistently ended up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships, not because they were mentally unstable, but because seeing through everything carried a psychological cost that no one understood. Today, I'll reveal Nietzsche's most dangerous insight about those who have broken away from the system and why he believed this rare capacity either destroys them or transforms them into something extraordinary. The case that revealed Nietzsche's most dangerous discovery began with his own psychological breakdown in Turin in 1889, when he collapsed in the street after witnessing a horse being beaten. In the decade leading to this collapse, Nietzsche had been meticulously documenting a pattern he observed in himself and in exceptional individuals throughout history, those who developed what he called the pathos of distance. These people could mentally step outside society's value systems and see them not as eternal truths, but as human constructions. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. To be your own man is hard business. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." This capacity to see through social constructs wasn't celebrated. It was psychologically devastating. Those who possessed it couldn't engage in small talk because they saw through social facades. They couldn't maintain friendships because others felt exposed and uncomfortable around them. They couldn't keep jobs because their presence disturbed the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. They were seeing what others couldn't or wouldn't see, and this vision isolated them completely. Nietzsche recognized that he wasn't documenting a pathology. He was observing what happens when someone develops the capacity to see social reality without its comfortable illusions, when perception becomes so penetrating that it compromises social survival. He noted that these individuals described society with unsettling accuracy. They speak of others as if they had access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I verify their observations through careful questioning, they prove remarkably accurate. This wasn't delusion or paranoia. It was a consciousness so advanced that it became socially dangerous. But Nietzsche discovered something even more disturbing. As the extraordinary perception of these individuals seemed impossible to explain, he began investigating what he later called the perspective of all perspectives, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intellect become overwhelmed by seeing through the interpretive filters everyone else uses to make sense of the world. Nietzsche wrote in his notes, "There are those among us whose intellectual apparatus is so finely tuned that they perceive not just the content of cultural narratives, but the process of narration itself." Modern research, like that on highly sensitive people, validates Nietzsche's initial observations. These studies show that about 20% of people have elevated sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Nietzsche identified something more specific within his psychological typology, those he called free spirits, comprising about 1% of the population, who don't just feel deeply but perceive unconscious patterns with stunning clarity. These individuals see the desperation behind confident presentations, the fear motivating dogmatic certainty, and the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Nietzsche wrote, "The danger isn't in perception itself, but in the existential isolation it creates. When someone clearly sees what others cannot or will not see, they become a mirror society cannot bear to face. This creates what he called the problem of the free spirit, when your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from collective participation in shared myths." The real danger, Nietzsche discovered, wasn't perception itself. As people with highly developed perception clearly see through others' unconscious motivations, they become targets of what Nietzsche extensively documented as ressentiment, where people unconsciously attack those who reflect what they refuse to recognize in themselves. Nietzsche wrote in Exe Homo, "Whoever despises himself still respects himself as one who despises." But he discovered this principle extended to all relationships when one person's shadow is reflected by another's clear perception. The unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Nietzsche documented this pattern repeatedly in his observations. The person who sees clearly is blamed for creating the problems they merely observe. Those with differentiated perception experience this constantly. When they gently suggested someone seemed disturbed, that person exploded, accusing them of being negative or creating drama. When they expressed concern about obvious issues, they were accused of being judgmental or inventing problems that didn't exist. Nietzsche realized this wasn't coincidence but psychological defense. In Human, All Too Human, he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it's easier to attack the one who reflects their shadow than to examine what's being reflected." This creates what Nietzsche called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals frequently become the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Nietzsche observed, "The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for everything the group cannot consciously recognize about itself." This pattern explains why these individuals not only feel misunderstood, but systematically targeted by a force they cannot rationally explain. But Nietzsche's most disturbing discovery was yet to come. As he observed that overwhelming perception manifested differently in different individuals, he identified distinct patterns within the free spirit type, each representing a different way of processing what lies beneath social convention. The artistic spirit sees through aesthetic norms and cultural expressions, perceiving the unconscious forces shaping taste and artistic judgment. They recognize how art serves as a mask for power, religious sentiment, or moral persuasion. These individuals not only see through artistic conventions, but feel in their bodies the tensions between what art claims to be and what it actually does. Nietzsche wrote, "The artistic spirit lives in a state of perpetual dissonance, experiencing both the beauty of expression and the often ugly drives it conceals. The philosophical spirit perceives psychological patterns and predicts behavioral outcomes with impressive accuracy. They see the invisible connections between ideas, tracing how concepts form systems of thought that ultimately serve psychological needs rather than truth." Nietzsche observed that they could predict the collapse of intellectual frameworks, moral systems, and religious beliefs months or years before they occurred, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition. He noted, "They possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others have not yet seen. The prophetic spirit can sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in culture, detecting social illness before symptoms fully emerge, perceiving exhaustion in civilizations before collapse is recognized, or feeling the bodily tension indicating collective anxiety." Nietzsche wrote, "These individuals function as early warning systems for psychological and cultural diseases in their environment." The Dionysian spirit, the rarest type Nietzsche encountered, combines penetrating insight with what he called the undifferentiated auxiliary function. They see everything but have difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. Nietzsche observed, "They live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving enormous amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively." Understanding one specific pattern is crucial, because each type requires different approaches to what Nietzsche called the challenge of integration. But first, we must understand why he considered this discovery so dangerous. As he observed the devastating effects of undifferentiated perception on these individuals, he concluded that seeing through everything without proper psychological integration represented real dangers to both individual and collective well-being. Nietzsche identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. The first danger is disruption of collective values. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the agreements on which social cohesion depends. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the tacit agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force." Nietzsche observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. The second danger is psychological isolation. Nietzsche documented how differentiated perception creates what he called the problem of the higher man. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, he wrote, "The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who don't possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't merely social, but existential. These individuals often report feeling they live in a different reality from everyone around them." The third and most dangerous threat is dissolution of identity. Nietzsche discovered that people who see through social constructs often lose touch with their own authentic nature. They become so flooded with seeing the manufactured nature of social identity that they cannot distinguish between their own internal world and what they've absorbed from the environment. Nietzsche called this the abyss of nihilism, a state where all psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual loses solid ground for their own values. He wrote, "The danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of seeing through all identities." This is why Nietzsche considered the integration of superior perception not just therapeutically important but philosophically urgent. As unintegrated superior perception represented such dangers, he developed what he called the revaluation of all values, a systematic approach to maintain individual identity while developing a conscious relationship with what lies beyond conventional understanding. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. Nietzsche taught that individuals with highly developed perception must first recognize when they are seeing through constructs that others take as real. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and external content unconsciously absorbed. Nietzsche wrote, "The first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development." Technique. Nietzsche instructed spending time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so one could recognize their authentic psychological voice. He wrote, "Only in silence, away from the noise of the marketplace, can one hear what is truly one's own." Phase 2. Creation of values. Nietzsche discovered that people who see through others' values often do so because they haven't created their own. The more you operate without personal values, the more disturbed you'll be seeing the arbitrary nature of social values. Nietzsche wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward." Creating values means recognizing that even if all values are human constructions, some constructions serve life better than others. It doesn't make you a bad person to recognize the constructed nature of morality. It makes you a more conscious creator of your own life. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase involves what Nietzsche called the eternal recurrence, the capacity to engage with social reality while maintaining awareness of its constructed nature, the ability to play social games without being played by them. Nietzsche wrote, "The individuated person can serve as a bridge between different perspectives, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their psychological integrity. This requires developing what Nietzsche called psychological containers, the capacity to temporarily hold contradictory perspectives while maintaining awareness that they are perspectives, not ultimate truths." As Nietzsche understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological collapse. The case of Pascal, unintegrated perception. Nietzsche was deeply influenced by Pascal's religious philosophy, but observed how his superior perception ultimately led to psychological collapse. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche wrote about Pascal's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, Nietzsche noted that Pascal never learned to integrate these perceptions constructively. Instead of using his perception in service of life affirmation, he wielded it as a weapon against human pride. Nietzsche wrote, "Pascal possessed an extraordinary perception of human nature, but remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality." Nietzsche observed that Pascal's isolation and eventual collapse represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual is consumed by what they see, rather than transformed by it. The case of Goethe, successful integration. Nietzsche studied extensively the poet and polymath Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Goethe possessed what Nietzsche called the Olympian perspective, the ability to perceive psychological and cultural realities others couldn't access. But unlike Pascal, Goethe channeled his perceptions into creative service. Nietzsche wrote, "Goethe transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways that invited understanding rather than resistance." Nietzsche noted that Goethe's success came from what he called conscious joy, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be wielded. Nietzsche's own integration journey. Most significantly, Nietzsche documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his illness years, from 1879 to 1889, recorded in his works and letters. Nietzsche wrote, "I was threatened by madness and was saved only by my capacity to understand what was happening to me through my observation of others. His superior perception of unconscious contents, both his own and others, nearly destroyed him, until he learned to integrate these experiences consciously. Nietzsche's discovery came when he realized his overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological, but evolutionary. They represented consciousness attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations. This realization transformed his approach with others with similar gifts. Since individuals with superior perception often face isolation, Nietzsche emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness. Nietzsche wrote, and thus spoke Zarathustra, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witness from those capable of recognizing authenticity." Nietzsche identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Type 1, free spirits. Nietzsche wrote, "The free spirit recognizes another free spirit immediately. There is a quality of presence, an authenticity that cannot be fabricated. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Nietzsche called the intellectual aristocracy. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With free spirits, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming them or threatening them. Type 2. Those engaged in self-overcoming. Nietzsche observed that people actively engaged in their own process of self-overcoming, intellectual exploration, inner work, spiritual practice, can often handle superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value. Nietzsche wrote, "Those who have begun to know themselves can bear being known by others." Type 3. Natural containers. Nietzsche identified individuals who, though they don't possess superior perception, have what he called the natural container function, the capacity to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These may be mature individuals who have faced significant challenges in life and developed psychological resilience. The recognition process. Nietzsche developed specific indicators for identifying safe relationships. 1. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending. 2. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame. 3. They demonstrate what Nietzsche called psychological mindedness, interest in inner reality. 4. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths. 5. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth. Gradual revelation protocol. Nietzsche taught a careful process for revealing perceptive abilities. 1. Begin with small, gentle observations. 2. Observe the pattern of response to feedback. 3. Assess whether they become defensive or curious. 4. Gradually increase depth based on their demonstrated capacity. 5. Always frame perceptions as offerings, not pronouncements. Nietzsche emphasized, the goal is not to find people who accept everything you see, but to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding, rather than threats to their self-image. As successfully integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development, Nietzsche saw successful integration as essential not just for personal well-being, but for the evolution of human consciousness. In The Will to Power, he wrote, "The individual has always been the bearer of the living spirit, the one who brings change to society." He believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he called cultural physicians, people who help consciousness evolve. The 4 phases of transformation. Phase 1. Recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when you learn to recognize your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them. Nietzsche called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. He wrote, "The beginning of wisdom is the recognition of what one truly is, not what one wishes to be or fears to be." Phase 2. Integration without isolation. The second phase involves learning to use your perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. Nietzsche called this social individuation, becoming authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. He observed, the individuated person does not withdraw from the world but engages with it more consciously. Phase 3. Service without sacrifice. The third transformation happens when your perception becomes a gift you offer, rather than a burden you carry. Nietzsche called this conscious participation, using your abilities in service to others without depleting yourself. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and then to offer that authentic self in service of the whole." Phase 4. Legacy without attachment. The final phase involves what Nietzsche called the eternal return, using your perception to contribute to the evolution of collective consciousness without attachment, to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. Nietzsche observed, "The individuated person works for the future, not for personal recognition in the present." Cultural medicine. Nietzsche believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception play a vital evolutionary function. They see what the collective consciousness is not yet ready to recognize, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. Nietzsche wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate." Highly perceptive individuals who learn to integrate help make unconscious contents conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. Specific pitfalls. As the path of integrating superior perception contains specific dangers, Nietzsche documented the most common ways individuals derail their own transformation process. Pitfall 1. The inflation trap. Nietzsche wrote extensively about psychological inflation when individuals identify with their superior function rather than consciously integrating it. In The Will to Power, he warned, "The danger is that the ego identifies with the archetype, leading to an inflation that cuts the individual off from human relationships." Highly perceptive individuals often fall into what Nietzsche called the prophet complex, believing they must save everyone from unconsciousness. This leads to preaching, judgment, and eventual isolation. Nietzsche observed, "The moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand." Pitfall 2. The withdrawal justification. Nietzsche documented cases where individuals used their superior perception to justify complete withdrawal from society. They convinced themselves that others were too unconscious to be worth engaging, which Nietzsche recognized as spiritual superiority disguised as wisdom. He wrote, "True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not flight from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but been defeated by it." Pitfall 3. The helping euphoria. Nietzsche observed that some highly perceptive individuals become addicted to being needed. They define themselves entirely by their ability to see and help others, losing touch with their own inner development. Nietzsche warned, "When perception becomes identity, the person disappears behind the function. This is not individuation, but its opposite, the sacrifice of personality for role." Pitfall 4. The return of overwhelm. Even successfully integrated individuals can regress during periods of stress, trauma, or major life transitions. They stop maintaining their psychological boundaries and become flooded again with the unconscious contents of others. Nietzsche emphasized, "Integration is not a permanent achievement but a dynamic process, requiring constant conscious attention." Maintenance of integration. Nietzsche developed ongoing practices for maintaining healthy integration. Regular solitude to distinguish your own psychological contents from absorbed material. Conscious choice about when and with whom to engage perceptive abilities. Ongoing shadow work to avoid projecting your own unconscious contents. Connection with others capable of providing reality checks and support. Creative expression as an outlet for overwhelming perceptual input. Nietzsche wrote, "The integrated person does not achieve perfection but learns to dance consciously with their own psychological complexity." As Nietzsche understood superior perception in the context of collective psychological development, he saw highly perceptive individuals as playing an essential evolutionary function for human consciousness. In The Will to Power, he wrote, "The individual has always been the bearer of the living spirit, the one who brings change to society." He believed that people with superior perceptions serve as pioneers of consciousness, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. The historical pattern. Nietzsche observed that throughout history, individuals with superior perception often appeared before the collective consciousness was ready to integrate their perceptions. They served as scouts for psychological territories humanity would eventually need to explore. Nietzsche wrote, "What first appears in the individual, a psychological insight, later manifests in the collective as cultural transformation. The individual serves as a laboratory for experiments in consciousness that will eventually benefit the whole." Modern manifestations. Nietzsche believed that in the modern era, highly perceptive individuals might be sensing psychological patterns explaining collective behavior, social and environmental unsustainability before it becomes obvious, spiritual possibilities beyond current religious frameworks, technological implications others haven't considered, contents of the collective shadow needing conscious integration. Nietzsche's insight. The sensitive individual feels collective problems first and most intensely. Their personal symptoms often reflect what the entire culture needs to address. Service without martyrdom. Nietzsche's crucial insight was that superior perception best serves evolution when consciously integrated rather than unconsciously suffered. The goal is not to be a martyr to consciousness but to be a bridge between what is and what is coming. Nietzsche wrote, "The individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole, the supreme integration. At the highest level of development, Nietzsche observed that individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to whether others accept what they see, perceiving deeply without the compulsion to fix everything they observe. Nietzsche called this the eternal return, the capacity to serve the evolution of consciousness naturally, without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Remember my opening statement about Nietzsche's most dangerous discovery? Let me bring this full circle. Nietzsche's most dangerous discovery wasn't that some people see through everything. It was that most people who see through everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger isn't in perception itself, but in failing to develop a conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You aren't too much for this world. You are exactly what the evolution of consciousness requires. Once you learn to wield your perception as consciously as Nietzsche learned to wield his. The danger of seeing through everything isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Nietzsche's description of the free spirit, you're part of a rare psychological type that Nietzsche believed was essential for the evolution of consciousness. Comment below what type of differentiated perceiver you are. Your journey of integration connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Nietzsche's discoveries about psychological development that transcends the limitations of collective unconsciousness. If you're ready to explore more of Nietzsche's insights about psychological types that don't fit conventional patterns, check out my video on 7 Dangerous Places in Friedrich Nietzsche's Philosophy That Will Break Your Mind, where I reveal the psychological environments that are particularly toxic for highly sensitive and perceptive individuals, and Nietzsche's strategies for protecting your consciousness while engaging with an unconscious world. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next dimension.